On June 2nd and 3rd, 2011, the Center for Design and Geopolitics held its first annual conference in La Jolla at Cal IT2, the California Institute of Telecommunications and Information Technology, on the campus of the University of California at San Diego.
So if any of you have any optimism left, Naomi will take care of that for you. So Charlie mentioned this notion of what is socially possible. Naomi's work is very, very broad, but one of the key things we've asked her to speak about today is particularly the ways in which the Enlightenment model of data, information, knowledge, as we called it, as a force of reason, does and does not accomplish the goals that we had set out for it in that way, and even the ways in which the production and proliferation, multiplication, exponential multiplication of data and information not only doesn't have a correspondent curve in our ability to use this, but in some ways has the opposite effect, and producing effects that we saw James Fowler showing yesterday of a kind of split into this red cluster, blue cluster models of cognitive universes, such that the multiple universe effect becomes a driver of our sociology as much as the physics. So Naomi, as I'm sure you know her work, wrote the key essay on polling the scientific consensus around climate change. She co-wrote one of my favorite books of last year, Emergence of Doubt, which is a history of the industrialization of denialism, we could say, in recent years. Naomi is one of the world's leading historians of science, currently a professor of history and science studies here at UCSD, adjunct professor at Scripps, and until recently the provost at Sixth College. She's received many grants and worked with NSF, National Endowment for the Humanities, American Philosophical Society, several August Awards and Francis Bacon Award in the History and Philosophy of Science, and many for the Emergence of Doubt book as well. So it's my pleasure to welcome Naomi Oreskes.
Well, thank you. And Ben is correct. I'm depressed. And I think it's time to just say that straight up. And I think it's not just that I've just come back from a conference in Germany on agnotology, the social construction and study of ignorance. I just spent 3 days listening to scholars talk about the production of ignorance and all of that. But also because I think what Ben said is exactly right, that the Enlightenment model, the model that we've all been living with, the model we were all raised with, and the model that I think this university and all research universities is really founded on, I think has failed us. So what I want to do today is a little different from what I usually do. Those of you who have heard me speak before know I usually have elaborate PowerPoint presentations with lots of illustrations and carefully honed and all that sort of thing. And what I want to do today, and Ben said this would be okay, is just to talk a little bit about a few things that are on my mind, a few of the sources of my depression, and then talk about the only hope that I think there is in this otherwise dismal situation. And I also just want to say one other thing. I'm generally an optimistic person. I think people who know me know that they am. I couldn't possibly have been a provost of a college here at UCSD if I weren't optimistic, maybe irrationally so. And for the last year, when I've been traveling a lot and talking about the book that I wrote with Eric Conway, I always get asked the question, are you optimistic? And for a year I've been saying, I am, because I don't know what the alternative is. And because I don't think we can give up hope. But at the same time, I'm starting to question my own position on that. I'm starting to think that actually we need to be depressed about this issue, and we need to communicate how depressed we are about it. We need to communicate how we feel, because I think part of the problem with the Enlightenment model is that we don't communicate how we feel about what we know. We only talk about the facts, and as Larry said in his talk, and I've said many times myself, one of the things I think we've learned in the last 50 years is that facts are not enough. So let me start by talking a little bit about the facts. And I want to start by just saying that I believe that climate change is no longer a scientific problem. And by that I mean that I agree completely with what Charlie Kennel just said, that we have known the science for a long time now. 6 years ago, when our Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger announced California's commitment to reducing greenhouse gas concentrations, he said, "We know the science, we see the threat, and we know the time for action is now." I thought that was kind of an amazing thing for a politician to say, and I actually voted for him in the second election. That was before I knew about the latest revelations. No, I still would have voted for him. I became a one-issue voter, you know. But I mean, this is correct. We have known about the possibility that greenhouse gases could drive major climate change for more than 100 years. And we have been doing serious, sustained scientific work on this issue for more than 50 years. And as Charlie pointed out, if you go back and read the scientific literature from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which I have done, what you see is that the basic scientific framework of this problem was already laid out in the late 1970s and early 80s. It was being communicated to policymakers in the mid to late 1970s and early 80s. In my own historical work, I've shown that it was communicated to every president since Lyndon Johnson. And if you look at the IPCC reports today and you ask yourself, what has really changed? Well, the size of the reports has grown exponentially. The number of people involved in this problem has grown exponentially. And the amount of money spent on this problem has grown hugely. Billions of dollars are now spent on the various national global climate research programs. And yet, what do we really know today that we didn't already know, let's say, to be conservative at the time of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change? And I would say, and this is not meant at any affront to any of my fantastic colleagues at Scripps and elsewhere, we know a lot more details, but in terms of what we need to know in terms of acting, I don't think we really know very much more at all. So that's rather depressing when you consider the amount of manpower, womanpower, money, publications, trees cut down for paper, you know, all of the resources, the human capital, the money that have gone into this. So why did we do all that work? It's an interesting question that I don't think we have a good answer for. And I think that when you stop and you actually take a breath and you step back from this world that we as university researchers live in, which is something that as a historian is part of my job to try to do, as difficult as that is, it seems to me we have a kind of data OCD. You know, it's like this obsessive compulsive disorder. We can't stop collecting data. And even scientists I know who over a beer will agree with what Charlie and I have just said, and over a beer will agree that we don't actually need a lot more data to inform public policy on climate change, yet they themselves are engaged in collecting huge amounts more data. And it's like we can't stop. It's like we're just on some kind of weird data treadmill. We cling to the idea that more data, more information will somehow help us, that there'll be some new crucial experiment. I've written, and Charlie knows a lot about acoustic tomography of ocean climate, which was supposed to be a crucial experiment that was going to prove once and for all that global warming is happening. But we know from the history of science that that crucial experiments are a myth. So why do we keep on going? And as Larry has pointed out, we have enormous amounts of evidence. If we actually look at this problem scientifically, we know that people don't, in fact, act on what they know. So that's a pretty depressing conclusion, right? And it's a pretty depressing conclusion for those of us who are university researchers, including those of us like myself who are now doing research on what we don't know and why we don't know it, right? So I leave that as something to think about. What the data do tell us, and which many of us have embraced, is that we are heading for extremely serious trouble. And that brings us to the question of adaptation. And I agree with everything that Charlie just said about adaptation. I think it's obvious. I think everyone who's involved in this issue knows that at this point we are beyond the point of stopping climate change. What we're really talking about now is stopping the worst case scenarios and adapting to the less worst case scenarios. But this still brings us back to the same problem. And I would argue that just as climate change is no longer a scientific problem, that adaptation is not primarily a scientific problem either, unless by scientific we mean social scientific. As both of the previous speakers pointed out, we will be living in a different world in the future. We will be living in a world of more increased extreme weather events, such as the unbelievable tornado we just witnessed in Joplin, Missouri last week. We will be living in a world of sea level rise. We will be living in a world of disrupted food supplies. We will be living in a world of changing disease vectors. in which the kinds of problems that we're used to dealing with will no longer be the same as they were. We will have to deal with problems that we aren't used to dealing with, and we know that humans are not very good about that. So we're looking at a future of disruption, social disruption, physical disruption, migration, disruptions in food supply, extreme weather events, etc. And I think that when we talk about adaptation, and I agree with Charlie completely that we need to be talking about adaptation, there's no question about that, but I think a lot of people talk about it in a very glib, almost blithe sort of way, as if it's simply a matter of a little bit of adjustment. You know, we'll adapt to climate change. I mean, this is something that climate skeptics and contrarians and deniers have been saying for a long time. Oh, don't worry, we'll adapt. When the time comes, we'll adapt. Bill Nierenberg, about whom I've written quite a bit, in 1983 wrote, well, people have always adapted, and, you know, they've taken their horses and their dogs with them, so we'll just do the same thing. But the world in which people always migrated was his argument. The world in which people migrated 200,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, even 200 years ago, was a very different world. A world in where national borders were either much more porous or didn't even exist. A world in which infrastructure was scarcely what it is today. So the idea that we might migrate without gigantic human dislocation, gigantic human suffering, I think is very unrealistic. And think about the people of Joplin. You know, when you read the details of the press reports of these events, there's so much amazing information about in the little things that people say. So one of the articles that I think was in the Los Angeles Times interviewed some people at one of the hospitals in which they said two amazing things. The first one was, well, they had a plan, they had an emergency management plan. They thought they were prepared, right? And they had what they called Code Gray, which basically meant a tornado was about to hit. And I love his Code Gray. He was gray, not red, because obviously red would panic everyone, right? So I'm wearing gray today because in honor of Code Gray. So the plan was supposed to be, first you'd get a warning that said, prepare for Code Gray, and then you'd get a warning that said, implement Code Gray. And how many people heard this? Did you read this interview? So there was no prepare for Code Gray because it just happened. There wasn't even time for the announcement to be made. So all of these plans that they had been put in place, all of this readiness, all of the drills that they had done amounted to nothing when the tornado hit at 200 miles an hour. Moreover, part of the emergency management plans for the city of Joplin involved evacuation of people, particularly from nursing homes, to the hospital. So what happens when the place that you've planned to evacuate to is itself destroyed? And many of the places that people thought they would evacuate to were, in fact, destroyed by their tornado. So what this shows us is that I think we sometimes think we've planned ahead, we think we're ready, but in fact, we aren't. And the reason we aren't ready is very clear. It's because if the climate system is changing, if hurricanes are getting stronger than they used to be, if tornadoes are happening outside of Tornado Alley, then we're moving into a whole regime of things that we're not used to, a future that's different from the past and with which we don't have good experience. So that leaves us with a conclusion that I'm not sure if Charlie agrees with or not, so we can talk about this more later, that although I agree we have to prepare for adaptation, I don't think that we're very good at preparing for what's going to come. I don't think we have a lot of experience to guide us. But I also think it's extremely important that when we talk about preparing for adaptation, we make clear that this is a both and, not an either or problem. And I think that Charlie and I do agree on this, but I think some people, when they talk about adaptation, they make it sound as if so long as we prepare to adapt, we can not worry as much about the mitigation issue. And I think that's entirely incorrect. I think everything we know, everything the science shows us, tells us that unless we both adapt, prepare for adaptation, but also take major steps to reduce greenhouse gases as soon as possible, then we're looking at potential outcomes for which I don't believe there's a meaningful definition of the term adaptation. If the West Antarctic ice sheet begins to break up, if we're looking at not half a meter of sea level rise, but 6 or 7 meters of sea level rise, then it means many of the world's major cities will be partially or entirely drowned. All you have to do is stop for a minute and think about the amount of infrastructure in the United States that is at or near sea level. Think of the number of airports you have flown in and out of recently that are right at sea level, including San Diego, San Francisco, Washington, Reagan, JFK, LaGuardia, I mean, huge, huge, huge amounts of American infrastructure are at sea level. Only half, 1 or 2 meters of sea level rise would drown trillions of dollars of infrastructure. So unless we do something to reduce greenhouse gases very quickly, we are looking at outcomes to which I don't believe any reasonable adaptation is going to be possible without massive losses of both life and property. Okay, so given that, what do we do? How the hell are we going to reduce greenhouse gases? Larry's already told us that he thinks it's basically hopeless, I think. Sorry, not Larry, Charlie. You guys are sitting so close to each other. Okay, maybe you didn't mean to imply that, but
We both said it.
you did say it. Okay, all right, good. You did say that. It's basically hopeless. So part of the reason it's hopeless is because of the problem of global governance, which is one of the topics of our meeting today. So the issue of governance is extremely interesting to me. When I was writing the book Merchants of Doubt, one of the things I came to understand about the people I was studying was that an enormous amount of their anxiety, in fact, probably most of their anxiety about the question of climate change, had to do with fear and anxiety that the problem of global governance, the problem of climate change, would lead to a demand for global governance and would lead to an increase in government power and an increase in tyranny and a loss of personal freedom and liberty. As a historian, I've always thought, and I think all of my historical colleagues would agree, that part of your job as a historian is to try to understand what the people you're studying think and believe and feel, and to try to understand as best you can why they did the things they did, whether or not you agree with them, even if you think they're wrong. So my good friend Robert Proctor, who studies both Nazis and the tobacco industry and thinks that they're just about the same, and likes to point out, as you did, Larry, that the amount of deaths from tobacco in the coming years are going to be more than an Auschwitz per annum. People think he's inflammatory when he says it, but it's true. Even if you believe that these people are evil and what they've done, you still want to understand as a historian why they did what they did, and you still want to try as much as possible to see if there's anything about their argument that you maybe could, in fact, agree with. And this is the place where I have, in fact, found the capacity to do that. Because I believe that the anxiety about governance is not ridiculous. I think there's plenty of reason from history to say that concerns about tyrannical and dictatorial government are not ridiculous. And especially since the people that I studied, people like Bill Nierenberg and Fred Seitz and Robert Jastrow and Dixie Lee Ray, were all Cold War scientists who had dedicated their lives to fighting Soviet totalitarianism and to protecting the United States from the Soviet threat, real or perceived. That the concern about what this means for personal liberty is not an unreasonable one. And the issue of global governance is interesting because if you look at, say, the last 30 or 40 years of this history, as Charlie pointed out, many people involved in this debate have been very preoccupied with the idea of global governance, both positive and negative. So the contrarians and climate skeptics and deniers had this anxiety that this would be used as a wedge to bring about global governance, which would become tyrannical, that we would lose authority to governance structures that were very far away from us and over which we had very little control. Conversely, some environmentalists looked to global warming as a wedge issue that could, in fact, lead to global governance and saw that as a good thing. In fact, one of the most interesting experiences I had in the last year or so talking about this issue was I was at a conference with Bob Watson, who many of you know as one of the original founders of the Ozone Trends panel that led to the Montreal Protocol. He was involved in governance issues regarding acid rain and one of the important leaders of the IPCC, a former leader before Pachauri. And Bob Watson, how many of you have ever heard Bob Watson speak? I mean, he's amazing. He makes me seem like I'm slow, right? So he's got, like, he talks a mile a minute. He gives these PowerPoint presentations with 700 slides, jam-packed with information. It's just unbelievable to listen to him speak. You're, like, exhausted and out of breath by the end of it just by listening. But at the end of this huge talk that he gave, this was at a meeting in Switzerland, he said, so at the end of the day, the only way we will solve the problem of global warming is through global governance. And I sat in my chair and I just cringed. I was like, no, Bob, don't say that, right? You know, that's just exactly what the climate change deniers think too, and that's the problem. Okay, so as Charlie pointed out, our track record with global governance isn't very good. There are some examples of global treaties that have been effective. Well, usually not global. Most successful treaties have been pretty focused. Typically, when the United States has been willing to go into treaties, they've been bilateral, maybe trilateral, or small multilateral treaties. The United States has never been keen on large international global treaties. And of course, as a historian, my favorite example of the aspirations of mankind is the famous Kellogg-Briand Pact. How many of you remember that from high school history, right? When the world's leaders promised to outlaw war. So the track record on global governance isn't very reassuring. It doesn't mean we have to give up on the possibility of meaningful international treaties. We did have a meaningful international treaty on the ozone hole, but it was in some ways a much smaller problem. But I don't think there's a great, I agree that there's not a lot of grounds for optimism in that domain. So are we left with anything? Well, there is one thing, and that's technology. So I'm happy to be talking about this here at Cal IT2, and I actually have a more optimistic view of technology than what Charlie laid out a few minutes ago. As a historian, I think a lot about what the driving forces of social change are in the world. And it seems to me, again, if you step back from history and you look at it, and you ask yourself the question, what has really changed the lives of people in the past 6,000 to 10,000 years? What has changed the way people live? I would say that not all of the major changes of human life have been driven by technology. Ideas and ideology have certainly played an important role, but an awful lot of the major changes of the last 10,000 years have been technologically driven. Indeed, we define human history in terms of technology, the Stone Age, the Iron Age, the Bronze Age. It's kind of interesting that we historians stop doing that at a certain point. I don't know why that is. As Larry pointed out, people don't act on information very well. We know it's not just tobacco and obesity. We could make a laundry list of 100 other things that people know about and yet ignore in their daily lives. And yet, at the same time, we also know that people do readily adopt novel technologies, sometimes stunningly quickly, right? I mean, I didn't grow up with a cell phone, and probably most of you didn't either, and yet we all have them now. And we all use them, even if they do maybe cause brain cancer. So why is it that we're so quick to adopt novel technologies, but so slow to act on information? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a really important question. I think it's a question that people in this room could help answer. I think it would be an incredibly interesting question for a place like Cal IT2 to be thinking about more. But I do think that history gives us some small grounds for hope here, because we do know that very significant transformative technologies have been developed in the past, and sometimes shockingly quickly. So if I think about the example that I know best, the one I teach to my undergraduates every year, is the atomic bomb. We always talk about the atomic bomb in the singular, the bomb, but it's really a mistake. We really ought to talk about the bomb system, because the creation of the atomic bomb was the creation of a huge technological system, a huge technological infrastructure involving installations in 30 states, over tens of thousands of people, not just physicists, but scientists of all types, mechanics, secretaries, cleaners, janitors, architects, engineers. I mean, the list went on and on and on. And the United States made the decision to do that because they believed that there was a clear and present danger, because Franklin Roosevelt believed that he had no choice but to do that. And he invested what was at that time a historically unprecedented amount of manpower, human capital, and money into making it happen. So we know it can be done if we are persuaded of the urgency. So I think this gets us back to me being depressed. That I think that we have to do more to persuade our fellow citizens of the urgency. And I think that in a strange way, we really have not done that. And that the scientific community, despite all of the huge amounts of work they have done, have not succeeded in communicating the urgency of this issue to the American people. And maybe that's because at the end of the day, it's just not something that scientists can do very well. That scientists, by nature of the type of work they do, by nature of the kinds of people they are, by nature of their training, and I say this as a recovered scientist, Well, I know when I was a scientist, I was taught in no uncertain terms that you didn't talk about how you felt. And that I became a geologist because I loved rocks, and I learned very quickly that you didn't talk about loving rocks if you wanted to be taken seriously, especially as a girl geologist in Australia in 1981. Okay, so for 40 years, 30 years, I didn't talk about loving rocks, but I do love rocks, and I love this planet, and I love polar bears, and I love nature, and I love winter. And I think that all of us need to do a better job of talking about what we love and how the things we love may be lost if we actually want the world to act on this issue. Thanks very much.